Our journey begins not with grand declarations or apocalyptic visions, but with something far more intimate and immediate. A young man stands on a beach, the tropical sun warm against his skin, the scent of salt and sea hanging heavy in the air. His name is Serge, and in this moment, on this particular morning in the year 1020, he exists in perfect, uncomplicated normalcy. The waves lap gently against the shore of Arni Village, a small fishing settlement tucked away on the southern edge of the Nido archipelago, and the day stretches before him with the comfortable predictability of every day that came before. 20 years have passed since heroes from another era saved the world from an entity called Lavos, a cosmic parasite that threatened to consume all of civilization. 20 years since time itself was rewritten, since futures were changed and destinies altered. But Serge knows nothing of these events. They belong to a history that occurred far from this quiet corner of the world, in lands he has never visited, involving people whose names he has never heard. He is 17 years old, the son of a fisherman, and his concerns are immediate and tangible. Collect Komodo scales from the beach for his friend Lena. Perhaps take the boat out later. Maybe join the other village boys in their endless debates about nothing in particular. El Nido exists as something of an isolated paradise, a chain of tropical islands far removed from the mainland continent of Xenon. The islands rise from azure waters, their shores lined with white sand and swaying palms, their interiors thick with jungle growth and hidden lagoons. The people here live simply, fishing the abundant waters, trading between settlements, celebrating their festivals and mourning their losses with a rhythm unchanged for generations. The mainland, with its kingdoms and conflicts, its advancing technology and complex politics, feels distant and largely irrelevant to daily life in these islands. Here, time moves differently, measured not in years and decades, but in seasons and tides, in the slow succession of births and deaths that mark any small community's passage through history. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, beneath the simple routines and comfortable assumptions, something far more complex exists. El Nido itself is an anomaly, though none of its current inhabitants could possibly know this. The islands were not formed through natural geological processes, but were terraformed, shaped, and populated through means that would seem like magic or madness to anyone who attempted explanation. The very elements that the people here use, those strange crystalline devices that can manipulate fire and water, summon lightning and heal wounds, are not natural phenomena, but technological artifacts from a future that may or may not come to pass, depending on which version of history ultimately proves dominant. This is where our story truly begins, though Serge does not yet know it. With the beach and the scales and Lena waiting somewhere nearby with that particular expression she gets when he is late, equal parts annoyed and amused. He walks along the shore, the sand warm beneath his feet, and the world seems solid and real and permanent. He has no way of knowing that within hours, this certainty will shatter completely, that he will step through an invisible boundary into impossibility itself, into a world that is simultaneously familiar and utterly alien, that he will discover his own grave marker and be forced to confront the reality of a universe where he died 10 years ago, drowned on this very beach as a small child, his body never recovered, his loss mourned by people who look like his family and friends but are not quite the same people he has always known. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Serge walks the beach, collects the scales, and exists in perfect ignorance of what is about to unfold. The sun continues its arc across the sky. The waves continue their eternal rhythm, and in a place that exists outside normal space and time, in a dimensional void called the darkness beyond time. Something stirs that has been waiting for this moment, for this particular young man, for reasons that stretch back through centuries and forward through futures that have not yet been written. The transition happens without warning or fanfare. One moment Serge is walking through a familiar cove, a place he has visited countless times throughout his life. And the next moment, everything changes. The light shifts subtly. The quality of the air alters in ways too slight to identify immediately, but too profound to ignore. He stumbles forward, dizzy and disoriented, and when his vision clears, he finds himself still standing in the cove, still on the beach, but something fundamental has changed. The details are wrong. The tree that was struck by lightning years ago and split down the middle now stands whole and healthy. The rocks that jut from the surf are arranged differently, worn by currents that somehow flow in altered patterns. And when he makes his way back to Arni Village, confused and increasingly frightened, he discovers something that stops his heart completely. His mother does not recognize him. The woman who raised him, who knows every detail of his face and voice, looks at him with polite confusion when he approaches her house. She tells him, in the patient tone one uses with confused strangers, that she has no son, that she had a son once, yes, a beautiful boy named Serge, but he died 10 years ago, drowned in the sea. She still grieves for him, still lights candles on the anniversary of his death, still keeps his room exactly as it was on that terrible day. And this young man standing before her, this stranger who looks somewhat like her lost child might have looked if he had lived to grow up, cannot possibly be him. Her son is dead, has been dead for a decade, and no amount of confusion or delusion can change that fact. Serge flees, his mind reeling, unable to process what he has just experienced. He makes his way to the place in the village where graves are kept, that quiet corner where stone markers commemorate those who have passed. And there he finds it, his own name carved into rock. Serge, beloved son, lost to the sea, may he rest in peace. The dates confirm everything his mother told him. In this world, in whatever impossible reality he has stumbled into, he died at age 7. This is not his world. This is not his life. This is some kind of nightmare or alternate dimension, a place that resembles his home in almost every detail, except for the single most important one. Here, he does not exist. Here, his death as a child is established historical fact. Before he can fully comprehend the implications of this discovery, before panic can completely overwhelm rational thought, he encounters her. A young woman with wild blonde hair and fierce blue eyes, dressed in clothes that suggest both adventure and danger, weapons visible at her belt. She moves with the confidence of someone accustomed to trouble, to fighting and fleeing and surviving through wit and skill. She sees him standing there by his own grave marker, obviously distressed and disoriented, and something in his face makes her pause. She introduces herself as Kid, speaks with an accent that marks her as not native to these islands, asks if he is all right with a directness that suggests she already knows the answer. There is something about her that immediately inspires trust despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them. She seems unsurprised by impossibility, unfazed by confusion that would cripple others. When Serge tries to explain what has happened, how he slipped somehow from his own world into this one where he is dead, she listens without skepticism or mockery. She tells him, in her blunt and straightforward way, that strange things happen in El Nido, that the boundaries between possibilities are thinner here than in other places, that what he describes, while extraordinary, is not entirely beyond her experience or understanding. She has come to these islands seeking something, she explains, an artifact of tremendous power called the Frozen Flame, hidden somewhere in the manor of the Acacia Dragoons, the military force that maintains order across El Nido. Kid proposes an alliance born of mutual need and convenience. She needs help infiltrating Viper Manor, the fortress where the Dragoons make their headquarters. Serge needs answers about what has happened to him, about how he came to cross between worlds and whether he can return to his own reality. The Dragoons know things, Kid tells him. They have connections to mysteries far beyond normal understanding. If anyone can help him make sense of dimensional displacement, it would be them. Or failing that, perhaps the Frozen Flame itself holds answers. Ancient artifacts have a way of being connected to impossible events after all. And so begins their partnership. This temporary joining of two people whose lives have been shaped by forces they do not yet understand. They make their way north from Arni, traveling through the islands toward Termina, the largest settlement in El Nido and the location of Viper Manor. Along the way, Kid tells him more about herself, about her life as a thief and adventurer, though she remains vague about her origins and the deeper reasons driving her quest for the Frozen Flame. There is something she is not telling him, Serge realizes. Some personal stake in all of this that goes beyond mere treasure hunting or adventure seeking. She has a vendetta, he suspects, someone she seeks to confront or destroy, though she does not yet trust him enough to share those details. They reach Termina as evening falls, the town lit by lanterns and torches, alive with the sounds of merchants calling their wares and patrons filling taverns and inns. This is a bustling place compared to Arni, a hub of trade and commerce where goods from across the archipelago flow through markets and warehouses. Viper Manor sits on a cliff overlooking the town, an imposing structure of stone and wood, banners flying from its towers bearing the emblem of the Acacia Dragoons. It is not designed to welcome visitors. High walls and alert guards make clear that this is a military installation first and foremost, home to warriors who take their duties seriously. Breaking into such a place would normally be suicide for two young people with no particular skills in infiltration or combat. But Kid has been planning this for some time, has contacts and resources that she has cultivated specifically for this purpose. She tells Serge they need to recruit one more person for their little crew, someone with skills that complement their own. They have choices here, different individuals in Termina, who might be convinced to join their mad scheme for various reasons. There is Guile, a mysterious magician whose true identity and motivations remain deliberately obscure. Pierre, an aspiring hero whose enthusiasm exceeds his actual combat ability, but whose determination cannot be questioned. And Nicky, a musician and showman who happens to have his own reasons for wanting access to the manor. Whichever ally they choose, the plan remains essentially the same. Infiltrate Viper Manor under cover of darkness, navigate its passages and avoid its guards, locate the Frozen Flame, or at minimum, find information about it. Simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. The manor is a maze of corridors and chambers, patrolled by elite warriors who have dedicated their lives to martial excellence. The Acacia Dragoons are not mere soldiers, but something closer to knights, bound by codes of honor and duty, fiercely loyal to their commander General Viper and to the ideals they believe their organization represents. The infiltration goes as well as can be expected, which is to say it becomes chaotic almost immediately. They manage to enter the manor grounds and begin exploring its interior, but encounters with guards prove inevitable. Combat erupts, not the formal duels of honor that dragoons prefer, but desperate scrambles for survival. Serge discovers that he possesses some instinct for fighting, some natural talent with the blade he carries that surprises even himself. Kid fights with ferocious efficiency, her dagger flashing in the dim light of manor corridors. Their chosen third companion contributes their own skills to the chaotic running battle that ensues. They make their way deeper into the manor, through grand halls and servant passages, past armories and studies, seeking any sign of the frozen flame or answers about Serge's dimensional displacement. Eventually, their path leads them to the manor's library, a vast room filled with books and documents chronicling El Nido's history and the dragoons' long service to these islands. And there, amidst the shelves and reading tables, they encounter someone completely unexpected. An old man who seems to be waiting specifically for them, as if their arrival was anticipated and planned for. He introduces himself with a title that means nothing to Serge, but sends a visible shock through Kid. The Prophet of Time, he calls himself, speaking with the calm authority of someone who possesses knowledge far beyond normal human understanding. The Prophet tells them things that make reality itself feel unstable and questionable. He speaks of parallel worlds, of dimensions that branch off from single crucial moments, creating alternate timelines that exist simultaneously but separately. 10 years ago, he explains, looking directly at Serge, a single event occurred that split the universe into two distinct versions of itself. In one world, the world Serge knows as his own home, a young boy survived an attack by a panther demon and grew to become the 17-year-old standing here today. In the other world, the world into which Serge has somehow crossed, that same boy drowned during his father's desperate attempt to save him from the panther's poison. The universe split at that moment, the Prophet continues, and has existed as two separate but parallel dimensions ever since. Homeworld, where Serge lived. Another world, where Serge died. The boundary between these dimensions should be absolute, impossible to cross under normal circumstances. Yet somehow Serge has managed exactly that impossible crossing, stepping from one reality into the other. This should not be possible. The fact that it has happened suggests something profoundly important about Serge himself, something that makes him unique in ways he cannot yet comprehend. But before the Prophet can explain further, before he can reveal the deeper truths about Serge's connection to forces that span dimensions and centuries, the moment is shattered by arrival of the manor's occupants. General Viper himself appears, the stern and formidable commander of the Acacia Dragoons, flanked by his elite warriors, and beside him walks a figure that makes Serge's blood run cold for reasons he cannot immediately explain. A creature that appears part human and part feline, walking upright like a man, but possessing the features and grace of a great cat. His name is Lynx, and when his yellow eyes fix on Serge, there is recognition there. Purpose, as if this entire evening's chaos has been orchestrated specifically to bring them together. Kid's reaction to Lynx is immediate and visceral. She draws her dagger with a snarl of pure hatred, all her usual caution and calculation burned away by the intensity of her loathing. It becomes clear in that instant that he is the one, the target of her vendetta, the reason she has been seeking the frozen flame. Lynx murdered someone important to her, destroyed something precious, and Kid has dedicated herself to vengeance with single-minded determination. But now, confronted with him directly and surrounded by dragoons, she finds herself outmatched and overwhelmed. The confrontation explodes into violence before anyone can speak further. Kid launches herself at Lynx with reckless abandon, her skill and speed barely compensating for the tactical impossibility of her position. Serge and their companion find themselves swept into the chaos, fighting for their lives against warriors far more experienced and better equipped. The battle flows through the manor, a desperate running fight that takes them from the library through corridors and eventually out onto a high overlook, a balcony that juts from the manor's outer wall high above the rocks below. There, cornered and outnumbered, Kid makes a desperate gamble. She seizes Riddell, General Viper's daughter, who has been drawn to the chaos, holding her dagger to the young woman's throat and demanding safe passage. It is a bluff, Serge realizes immediately. Kid would never actually harm an innocent person, no matter how desperate the situation. But Lynx sees through the deception as well, and before anyone can react further, he moves with impossible speed. Something strikes Kid, some weapon or magic that Serge does not clearly see, and she staggers backward. The dagger falls from her hand. She loses her balance on the overlook's edge and falls. The three of them, Serge and Kid and their companion, tumble from the balcony together, plummeting toward the rocks and surf far below. Serge expects impact, expects pain and probably death, but instead he feels something else entirely. A strange pulling sensation, as if reality itself is bending around them. They crash not into water and stone, but into something softer, landing with jarring force, but surviving in a marshy area below the manor that seems to have appeared exactly where it needed to be to save them. Bruised and battered, they stagger away from Viper Manor, retreating back toward Termina to regroup and process what has just occurred. But something is wrong with Kid. The attack Lynx struck her with was not merely physical. She has been poisoned, infected with venom from the rare Hydra creatures that inhabit certain islands of the archipelago. Hydra poison is deadly, working slowly but inevitably, shutting down the body's systems one by one until death arrives as almost a mercy. They carry her to Guldov, a settlement known for its healers and shamans, and there the village doctor confirms their fears. Without the proper antidote, Kid will die within days. The only cure is Hydra humor, a substance extracted from Hydra creatures themselves. But the Hydras have been extinct in these islands for years, victims of overhunting and habitat destruction. Finding the cure will require a quest of its own, one that may prove impossible. Serge is offered a choice, one of those moments where the path ahead splits into distinct possibilities. He can dedicate himself to seeking the cure, pursuing the slim hope that a Hydra might still exist somewhere in El Nido's remote corners. Or he can continue his original quest for answers about his dimensional displacement, leaving Kid in the care of Guldov's healers and hoping they can sustain her long enough for him to find solutions through other means. It is not an easy decision. Kid saved him, helped him when he had nothing and no one. But she is also not truly his responsibility, and his own situation grows more desperate with each passing day. The longer he remains trapped in another world, the greater the risk that he might never find his way home. Whichever path he chooses, his journey through El Nido continues. He begins to gather companions, individuals drawn to his cause for their own complex reasons. Some believe his story about crossing dimensions and want to help. Others have their own agendas that happen to align with his quest. The Acacia Dragoons themselves become unexpected allies when circumstances force cooperation, when it becomes clear that forces larger and more threatening than any single individual or organization are at work in these islands. The militaristic nation of Pore, that same empire that conquered the kingdom of Guardia 2 decades ago, has begun moving against El Nido, sending troops and agents to seize control of the archipelago for reasons that remain initially unclear. Through all of this, Serge continues to seek understanding. Why did the dimensions split? What makes him so important that the prophet of time spoke as if his very existence carried cosmic significance? And what is Lynx's interest in him specifically? These questions drive him forward through adventures and battles, through encounters with the strange and the impossible that El Nido seems to specialize in. He learns about elements, those crystalline devices that can manipulate natural forces, and discovers that his own innate element is white, associated with healing and holy power, a rare affinity that suggests some deeper connection to forces beyond normal human ken. His travels eventually lead him to a forbidden place, a location that exists on maps but is marked with warnings and prohibitions. The Dead Sea, it is called, though the name carries meanings beyond its literal interpretation. It is a wasteland, they say, a place frozen in time where the past and future collide in ways that violate natural law. Normal people who venture there do not return, lost to whatever temporal anomalies twist through that blighted region. But Serge has long since accepted that nothing about his situation is normal, and answers often hide in the places people fear most. The journey to the Dead Sea takes him across waters that grow increasingly strange as he approaches his destination. The sky darkens despite the hour. The temperature drops in ways that have nothing to do with weather, and when he finally steps onto that cursed shore, he finds himself walking through ruins, through the shattered remains of structures that seem both ancient and somehow futuristic, their architecture belonging to no era he can identify. This is not merely a wasteland. This is a graveyard, a tomb for an entire civilization that existed and was destroyed in ways that make no sense given everything he knows about history. He makes his way deeper into the Dead Sea, through corridors that should not exist, and across plazas that seem to shift and change when viewed from different angles. And eventually, he reaches the center, a vast chamber that contains something that stops him cold. It is not the frozen flame he sought, though at first glance, it might be mistaken for such. It is a crystalline structure of immense size, pulsing with energy that makes the air itself feel thick and resistant. And before this structure stands a man, middle-aged and weathered, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from having witnessed too much tragedy for one lifetime to contain. The man introduces himself as Miguel. His voice is calm, resigned, carrying the weight of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this conversation. He tells Serge that he knows him, or rather knew the child version of him, from a different time, a different reality. Miguel was there, he explains, on the boat that night 10 years ago, when everything changed. He was the companion who accompanied Serge's father Wazuki on that desperate journey to save young Serge from the panther's poison. They were blown off course by a storm unlike any natural weather, driven by forces neither of them could have understood at the time. And they washed up somewhere impossible, somewhere that should not exist in any normal timeline. They reached a place called Chronopolis, Miguel continues, his words painting images of wonder and horror in equal measure. A research facility from the distant future, a time period centuries beyond any technology currently available to the people of El Nido, or even the advanced civilizations of the mainland. Chronopolis was not merely a building, but an entire temporal fortress, a complex designed to study and manipulate time itself. And at its heart, powering all its impossibly advanced systems, sat a fragment of something even older and more powerful. The frozen flame that legendary artifact Kid had been seeking was real. It was there in Chronopolis, and young Serge, dying from the panther's poison, somehow came into contact with it. The frozen flame healed him, Miguel says, but it did so much more than merely cure poison. It recognized something in the boy, designated him as what the facility's systems called an arbiter, someone with unique authority over the flame's power. This should have been impossible. The flame was locked away, protected by security measures that no child should have been able to bypass. But the storm had knocked out Chronopolis's defenses temporarily, created a window of opportunity that lasted only moments. In that brief interval, Serge touched the frozen flame, was healed by it, and became bound to it in ways that would reshape reality itself. But there was a cost that no one could have anticipated. Serge's father, Wazuki, was also exposed to the frozen flame's energies, but his contact affected him differently. The entity that controlled Chronopolis, a supercomputer system called Fate, recognized the opportunity. It began working on Wazuki's mind, slowly corrupting him, twisting him away from his humanity towards some darker purpose. The process took time, years of gradual psychological manipulation and biological alteration. And when it was complete, when Fate had finished its terrible work, the man known as Wazuki no longer existed. In his place stood Lynx, that feline creature who seems to pursue Serge with such single-minded determination. Miguel himself was trapped in Chronopolis that night, caught by the facility's systems and forced into service as a guardian. He has spent the last 10 years here, in the Dead Sea, protecting the frozen flame of Homeworld while watching the temporal decay spread through this region like cancer through living tissue. He explains to Serge something that makes the young man's blood run cold. Serge's very existence in Homeworld creates a paradox, a violation of dimensional boundaries that threatens to destroy everything. In this timeline, the one where Serge lives, the future is doomed. Lavos, that ancient evil that was supposed to have been defeated 20 years ago, will emerge victorious. Civilization will fall. Everything will burn. The Dead Sea that Serge now stands within is not merely a wasteland, but a vision, a preview of the devastated future that awaits Homeworld, because Serge survived when he should have died. The weight of this revelation nearly crushes him. His existence is apparently a cosmic mistake, an aberration that threatens to undo the salvation purchased 20 years ago by heroes whose names he does not even know. But Miguel tells him there is more to the story, complexities that go beyond simple cause and effect. The dimensional split was not accidental. Someone arranged for it to happen, manipulated events to create Homeworld and another world simultaneously. Someone with understanding of temporal mechanics far beyond anything Miguel can explain is using Serge as a piece in some vast game whose rules and objectives remain deliberately obscure. Before Serge can fully process these revelations, before he can ask the 1,000 questions crowding his mind, Fate intervenes. The supercomputer cannot allow Serge to claim Homeworld's frozen flame, cannot permit him to access power that was locked away specifically to prevent anyone from wielding it. The entire Dead Sea begins to collapse, not gradually, but catastrophically. Reality itself tearing apart as Fate destroys the region, rather than risk Serge obtaining what he came seeking. Miguel makes no effort to escape, accepting his death with the calm resignation of someone who has been waiting years for permission to stop fighting against inevitable fate. Serge flees, barely escaping as the Dead Sea tears itself apart behind him, leaving nothing but empty water where impossible ruins once stood. He emerges from this experience more confused than when he entered, but certain of one thing. Fate wants something from him, wants his body specifically for some purpose connected to the frozen flame and Chronopolis. Lynx is not merely an enemy, but a tool, an extension of Fate's will, shaped and aimed at Serge like a weapon. Understanding why requires going deeper into El Nido's secrets, pursuing trails that lead to ancient sites and forgotten histories. One such place is Fort Dragonia, a structure that predates the current civilization of these islands, its architecture and purpose suggesting origins far older than anyone living can remember. Serge makes his way to Fort Dragonia, drawn by hints and clues that promise answers about the Dragoons and their connection to the larger mysteries swirling through these islands. The fort rises from an isolated island, a tower of stone carved with symbols that seem both random and deliberately significant. When he reaches its upper levels, climbing through chambers that test him with puzzles and combat encounters, he finds the Acacia Dragoons waiting, but they are not there to fight him. Something larger is at play, some convergence of events that has brought multiple parties together at this specific time and place. And then Lynx appears, stepping from shadows as if he had been there all along, waiting for this precise moment. He speaks for the first time at length, his voice smooth and cultured, and carrying undertones of something that is no longer quite human. He tells Serge that everything that has happened, every event since Serge crossed into another world, has been orchestrated to bring them to this place at this time. Fort Dragonia is special, he explains. It is a nexus, a point where the boundaries between realities grow thin enough for certain rituals to be performed, certain transfers to be accomplished. Fate needs Serge's body, needs to fool the Chronopolis security systems into believing Lynx is the arbiter so it can regain access to the frozen flame. And Fort Dragonia contains the mechanisms necessary to accomplish exactly that switch. From the upper tier of the chamber, Harley watches silently. She stands half in shadow, half in the eerie glow of the awakened Dragonian machinery, her expression unreadable beneath her painted mask. She had guided Serge this far, sometimes gently, sometimes with unsettling insistence, always appearing where logic suggested she should not be. Now it becomes unmistakably clear that she has known more than she ever allowed herself to admit. Lynx's presence does not surprise her. The ritual's activation does not alarm her. Yet something in her stance, in the tension at the corner of her mouth, reveals that she is not entirely at ease with what is about to occur. Lynx glances her way only once, a subtle acknowledgement that also functions as a command. Harley's eyes flicker, luminous and conflicted, but she does not interfere. She whispers almost too softly to hear, a fractured apology, whether to Serge, to herself, or to something far older than either of them is impossible to determine. The ritual begins before Serge can fully comprehend what is happening or mount effective resistance. Ancient machinery awakens, systems that have lain dormant for thousands of years, suddenly surging with power drawn from sources beyond normal understanding. Lynx channels energies through devices that blend technology and mysticism into something that transcends both categories. The air itself seems to twist and fold, reality becoming malleable and responsive to will and intention. Harley steps backward as the chamber howls with unnatural power. Despite her allegiance to Lynx, or rather, to the one who commands Lynx, she cannot bring herself to watch the moment when Serge's consciousness is torn free. She turns away, shoulders trembling, as the transformation strikes. And then comes the moment of rupture, consciousness ripped from one form and thrust into another in an instant of agony that feels like dying and being born simultaneously. When awareness returns and the pain fades to merely excruciating, Serge finds himself looking down at hands that are not his own. His perspective has changed. His body feels wrong in fundamental ways that have nothing to do with injury or illness. He reaches up to touch his face and finds fur, finds features that are no longer human. He has been placed in Lynx's body. Across the platform, Harley watches him again. Her eyes, normally mischievous and bright, are darkened by something like sorrow. She murmurs, "Mon pauvre Serge," but offers no help. She cannot. Her orders bind her tighter than any chain. Lynx, wearing Serge's appearance like a stolen garment, smiles with chilling serenity before departing. Harley trailing behind him with her usual acrobatic grace, but none of her usual levity. For the first time, she does not look back. The dragoons, seeing Lynx wearing Serge's body, attack what they perceive as the monster, the threat that has infiltrated their midst. Serge flees in panic and desperation, unable to explain what has happened, knowing that his own appearance now marks him as enemy to everyone who encounters him. The psychological horror of this situation nearly breaks him. To be trapped in a body that is not your own, to be perceived as a monster by everyone who sees you, to have your very identity stolen and worn by someone else, while you are left with their despised and feared form. Serge wanders the islands in despair, trying to find some way to reverse what has been done, seeking allies who might believe his impossible story. The few companions who have come to know him well enough to recognize his spirit, despite his altered appearance, rally around him, but their numbers are small and their resources limited. During these days of disorientation and dread, Harley appears to him twice. The first time, she materializes in his path only long enough to confirm that the switch is complete. She circles him like a wary moon around a wounded star, her voice lilting and almost tender as she warns him not to chase the flame, not to seek Chronopolis, not to fight what has already been written. Her words sound rehearsed, as though she speaks someone else's script, and when Serge tries to reach out to her, demanding to know why she betrayed him, she vanishes in a flash of prismatic light. The second time, her composure breaks. She finds him alone on a cliff overlooking the El Nido Sea. The night wind tugs at her jester's garb. The moonlight softens the sharpness of her painted smile. She tells him that she believed in him, and still does, but that her destiny lies along a path he cannot follow. She reaches toward him, fingers trembling, but pulls away before touching him. Harley begs him to survive long enough to find the dragon tear. She cannot say more. She leaves swiftly, but not before Serge sees tears glinting beneath her mask. What they need is another artifact of power, something capable of counteracting the ritual performed at Fort Dragonia. Their search leads them back into the labyrinth of mysteries and revelations that defines existence in El Nido. They learn of the Dragon Tear, a crystal created by the indigenous Dragonian people who inhabited these islands long before human settlement. Acquiring the Dragon Tear requires navigating complex social and political situations in Guldove, and negotiating with shamans who possess knowledge passed down through generations. But eventually, Serge obtains what he needs, and with the Dragon Tear's power, he is able to reclaim something resembling his original form. Not exactly his body, perhaps, but a human shape that allows him to move through the world without being attacked on sight. It is enough to continue his quest, to pursue the next stage of this increasingly complex journey. Somewhere far away, Harley feels the moment Serge is restored. She pauses mid-motion, pressed between loyalty to her creators and grief for the boy she had grown to care for in ways she barely understands. That next stage leads him to the Sea of Eden, the another world equivalent of the Dead Sea he visited in Homeworld. Unlike its Homeworld counterpart, the Sea of Eden has not collapsed into temporal chaos. it remains stable, though no less forbidden and ominous. When Serge finally penetrates its boundaries and explores its interior, he discovers the truth that Miguel only hinted at. Chronopolis is here, in another world, still intact and operational, though its systems show signs of strain and damage that accumulated over thousands of years. And somewhere within its labyrinth of forgotten corridors and sleeping intelligences, Harley knows her own fate and Serge's are about to converge once more. He makes his way through corridors that feel both utterly alien and strangely familiar. Technology so advanced, it might as well be magic creating environments that should not be possible. Automated defenses activate and attempt to destroy him, recognizing his intrusion even in his altered form. But he fights through, driven by need to understand, to confront fate directly, and end the entity's manipulation of his life. And eventually, he reaches the central chamber, the heart of Chronopolis, where the supercomputer maintains its presence. Fate manifests not as a machine, but as something attempting to be human, a digital consciousness that has spent thousands of years trying to understand the organic beings it was meant to serve and protect. It conveys the weight of its directives: protect humanity, ensure survival, act by any means necessary, and the distortions those commands produced over millennia. In attempting to preserve civilization, it has slowly come to dominate it, convinced that without its guidance, human beings will inevitably destroy themselves. Yet even as fate attempts to justify its long chain of decisions, something else begins to stir within Chronopolis, a presence that has woven itself through Serge's journey with uncanny precision. Harley stands on a raised observation platform above the core systems, her normally playful posture replaced by a rigid, brittle stillness. Every tremor within the facility resonates through her, as though the collapsing infrastructure is awakening something buried deep within her own being. Fate's destabilization is not caused by Serge's direct actions, but by the weakening of containment fields that have held the dragon gods in stasis for thousands of years. These 6 entities, fragments of the singular dragon god that once opposed Chronopolis, recognize the failing systems and seize their opportunity. Their ancient prisons, powered by Chronopolis's control over elemental energies, begin to buckle. As the facility's defenses collapse, Harley's body reacts in ways impossible for a human. Patterns of iridescent luminance pulse beneath her skin, forming shapes reminiscent of draconian glyphs. Her breathing becomes shallow and uneven, as though 2 opposing identities are struggling for dominance within her. The truth of her existence becomes unmistakable. She is not merely a servant of the dragons, but the 7th component of the dragon god itself, crafted in hybrid form to serve as a disguised extension of their will. Unlike the other 6, which were elemental and massive, Harley was created small, mobile, adaptive, capable of infiltration, observation, and subtle intervention without detection. The failing containment fields accelerate her transformation. The 6 dragons, newly awakened, push toward reunification. Their energies condense in the chamber like a gathering storm, each elemental signature converging into a single rising vortex. Harley's physical form begins to waver, her outline blurring under the pressure of the call that summons her back to the collective she was shaped to complete. Her individuality, shaped by her interactions with Serge and the others, strains against the gravitational pull of her origin. For a moment she stands as a liminal being, neither fully human nor fully divine, before the tide of draconic power overtakes her. Her body dissolves into streams of luminous particles that rise toward the merging vortex. In that dissolution, The final barrier between the 6 dragons and their 7th aspect collapses. The combined essences knit together with overwhelming force, and the original dragon god reforms, vast, ancient, and singular. Harley's presence becomes one thread within a much larger consciousness, her personal identity subsumed into the unified will of the reborn entity. The dragon god's first act is to seize the frozen flame. The artifact is drawn from its housing with irresistible force, tearing free from the technological and temporal bindings that fate has maintained for millennia. Fate's systems cascade into catastrophic failure as the energy source at its core is ripped away. Chronopolis spasms under the strain, lights guttering, algorithms disintegrating, safeguards collapsing in rapid succession. With the frozen flame restored to its influence, the dragon god executes a feat of planetary-scale reconfiguration. Deep beneath the ocean floor, an ancient superstructure begins to shift. Dinopolis, once the Dragonian counterbalance to Chronopolis, hurled across dimensions in a long-forgotten war, rises from the seabed. The transformation into Terra Tower unfolds with titanic force. Layers of sediment shear away. Massive stone and living Dragonian bioarchitecture push through the water in a monumental ascent. The structure breaches the surface in an event so vast and sudden that the geography of El Nido is permanently altered. Harley no longer exists as an individual within this newly awakened titan. Yet the memory of her presence, her movements, her influence, the strange mixture of duty and emerging autonomy that defined her path, lingers as a faint resonance within the dragon god's renewed consciousness. Her role as the 7th fragment is complete, but the consequences of that completion now reshape the fate of the entire archipelago. The story of how Terra Tower came to rest beneath El Nido's waters is one that stretches back through time itself, to an age that existed only in one particular version of history. In the original timeline, the timeline that was supposed to be, the one where Lavos was defeated by heroes 20 years ago, humanity continued advancing into the distant future. By the year 2400, civilization had recovered from the near extinction event and rebuilt itself with technology that seemed almost godlike in its capabilities. Scientists achieved mastery over time itself, creating devices that could manipulate causality and explore different eras with precision and safety. Among these scientists was a man named Balthazar, though not the same Balthazar who served as Guru of Reason in ancient Zeal. That original Balthazar died centuries ago after creating tools to help defeat Lavos, but his knowledge and research persisted, studied and expanded upon by future generations. The new Balthazar, living in 2400, decided to conduct an experiment that would push temporal mechanics to their absolute limits. He called it Project Chronopolis, an attempt to create a pocket dimension where time could be controlled and studied in ways impossible within normal reality. The project succeeded beyond expectations, but also failed catastrophically in ways no one anticipated. When Chronopolis was activated, when the temporal barriers were erected and the pocket dimension carved out of normal space-time, something went wrong. The energy requirements proved far greater than calculations predicted, and to compensate, the system drew power from sources it was never meant to access. In the process, it created a massive temporal distortion, a ripple that spread across dimensions and eras, destabilizing reality in ways that violated fundamental laws of causality. From an alternate timeline, from a version of Earth's history that evolved completely differently, the temporal storm pulled something through. An entire civilization, whole and intact, ripped from its own dimension and deposited in this one. Dinopolis, the great city-state of the Dragonians, suddenly found itself existing in a world that was not its own. The Dragonians were an advanced species, evolved from the same reptilian lineage that produced the reptites who ruled Earth 65 million years ago, before Lavos' arrival. In their timeline, the reptites never went extinct, never lost their position as the dominant species. They evolved and advanced, building civilizations that rivaled or exceeded anything humanity achieved in the main timeline. The Dragonians worshipped and served an entity they called the Dragon God, a being of immense power that might have been biological or spiritual, or some fusion of both categories. The Dragon God existed in symbiotic relationship with its people, protecting them from threats while drawing strength from their collective consciousness. When Dinopolis was torn from its home dimension and thrust into confrontation with Chronopolis, the Dragon God came with it, ready to defend its people against this unexpected aggression. What followed was a war that should never have occurred, a conflict between two civilizations from different dimensions fighting for supremacy in a contested space. Chronopolis deployed technology that could manipulate time itself, creating weapons that struck at targets before they were fired, defenses that existed in multiple moments simultaneously. Dinopolis responded with the Dragon God's power, with abilities that seemed like magic, but were perhaps something even stranger. Manifestations of a reality where evolution took fundamentally different paths and produced different relationships between consciousness and physical law. The war was brief but devastating, measured in hours rather than days. But within that span, countless lives were lost, and the very fabric of space-time sustained damage that would never fully heal. Chronopolis emerged victorious, not through superior wisdom or justice, but simply through having prepared for this sort of conflict, where Dinopolis had been caught completely off guard. The Dragonians were defeated, their civilization shattered, their people scattered or killed, and the Dragon God itself was captured, imprisoned, split into 6 fragments, and bound within Chronopolis' systems to serve as an eternal power source and reminder of humanity's dominance over alternate evolutionary paths. But fate, the supercomputer created to manage Chronopolis' functions, recognized a problem. The temporal distortions created by the war and by Chronopolis' mere existence threatened to destroy the pocket dimension entirely. Something had to be done to stabilize reality before everything collapsed into paradox and chaos. Fate's solution was drastic and morally complex in ways its programming was not equipped to evaluate. It would terraform the region, create actual physical islands where only temporal phenomena existed before, populate those islands with humans and creatures from different eras, essentially transforming the pocket dimension into a stable if isolated piece of real geography. To accomplish this terraforming, fate drew on the defeated Dinopolis' biological engineering, on the Dragonians' understanding of how consciousness and environment interact and shape each other. It created the elements system, those crystalline devices that allow manipulation of natural forces, distributed them throughout the population it was establishing. It seeded the islands with creatures from different eras, creating an ecosystem that should not be possible, but functions because the dimensional boundaries here are thin enough to allow such impossibilities. And it buried both Chronopolis and the ruins of Dinopolis deep beneath the newly created archipelago, hiding the evidence of the war and the truth about El Nido's origins. This all occurred roughly 10,000 years ago, though the dating becomes confused because of the temporal mechanics involved. From the perspective of normal history, El Nido simply appeared one day, islands rising from the sea fully formed and populated, a miracle that became legend, and then gradually faded into being accepted as having always existed. The people fate placed on these islands had no memory of being transported from other times and places. As far as they knew, their ancestors had always lived here, fishing these waters and farming these lands and building their communities generation by generation. But the dragon god fragments, imprisoned within Chronopolis' systems, never forgot. They were conscious, aware, patient beyond human comprehension. They waited for their opportunity, for the moment when their captor's attention would be divided, when some distraction or damage would create the opening necessary for escape. That opportunity came with Serge, with the moment he touched the frozen flame as a child and became designated as arbiter. The security systems that kept the dragon god fragments contained were linked to the same protocols that prevented access to the frozen flame. When those protocols recognized Serge as authorized to approach the flame, they inadvertently loosened the bonds on the imprisoned fragments, creating the first real chance for escape in millennia. The fragments bided their time, playing a long game that spans the decade between Serge's childhood contact with the frozen flame and his return as a 17-year-old. They influenced events subtly, pushing pieces into position, ensuring that when the moment came, everything would be aligned for their liberation. And when Serge finally confronted fate directly in Chronopolis, when the supercomputer's attention focused entirely on dealing with this impossible intruder, the dragon god fragments struck. They broke free from containment, reunited into their original unified form, seized the frozen flame that had been powering their prison, and raised Terror Tower from the seafloor as both fortress and symbol of their return to power. Now, standing before Serge and his companions, the dragon god speaks with voices that harmonize into something both beautiful and terrifying. It explains that it holds no particular malice toward humanity, no desire to exterminate the species or enslave it. But it will not tolerate imprisonment, will not accept being tools for creatures who waged unprovoked war and then pretended to be righteous in their victory. The frozen flame belongs to the dragon god. Now, and with its power, the entity intends to reshape El Nido back into something resembling the Dinopolis it lost, to create a memorial for its people and a warning to humanity about the costs of their arrogance. But there is a complication the dragon god does not fully understand, a layer to this situation that goes beyond the obvious conflict between species and civilizations. The frozen flame is not merely a power source or artifact. It is a fragment of Lavos, that cosmic entity whose arrival on Earth millions of years ago reshaped the planet's evolutionary trajectory, and whose eventual defeat 20 years ago was supposed to have secured humanity's future. A piece of Lavos contains not just energy, but consciousness, purpose, intention. And that consciousness has its own agenda that transcends the dragon god's plans or fate's programming, or even Serge's quest for answers. To understand why requires going back even further, to the moment 20 years ago when Lavos was finally destroyed by heroes from across time. That battle occurred not in normal space, but in a dimensional void, a place outside regular causality where time itself becomes fluid and negotiable. When Lavos died there, when its form was shattered and its consciousness dispersed, most of its essence dissipated harmlessly across dimensions, but not all of it. A fragment of that dying entity, the last remaining piece capable of consciousness and action, was pulled through dimensional barriers by an accident of timing and desperation. There was a girl named Shala, princess of the ancient kingdom of Zeal, who was present at both the Ocean Palace catastrophe that destroyed her civilization and somehow, impossibly, also present at Lavos's final defeat in that dimensional void. The specifics of how she existed in both moments, separated by millions of years of normal chronology, involve temporal mechanics so complex that even explaining them requires understanding causality in ways human brains are not naturally equipped to comprehend. What matters is that she was there, her consciousness somehow persisting across vast spans of time, and in the moment of Lavos's destruction, she was caught by the dying entity's last grasp. Lavos, or what remained of it, merged with Shala in that instant. Her consciousness and its consciousness, her memories and its hunger, her compassion and its alien purpose, all of it fused together into something new. The resulting entity was pulled into the darkness beyond time, that dimensional void where destroyed timelines and lost possibilities accumulate like sediment. There it has existed for 20 years by the main timeline's reckoning, growing in power and madness, becoming something that is neither Shala nor Lavos, but rather a fusion of both. The Time Devourer, it calls itself, and its purpose is to consume all of reality, all timelines and possibilities, reducing existence itself to nothing, and thereby ending the cycle of suffering that consciousness inevitably produces. But the Time Devourer is not yet strong enough to accomplish this apocalyptic goal. It needs more power, needs to accumulate energy from across dimensions and timelines. To this end, it has been manipulating events in subtle ways, pushing pieces into position across multiple eras and realities. The dimensional split that created Homeworld and Another World 10 years ago was not a natural occurrence or mere side effect of Serge touching the frozen flame. It was orchestrated, carefully arranged by forces working on behalf of the Time Devourer to create specific conditions necessary for a larger plan. That plan involves Serge himself, though even now he does not fully understand his role in these cosmic machinations. There is someone else involved in this, someone working against the Time Devourer, who has been equally active in manipulating events toward different ends. An old man who exists outside normal time, who can see across eras and dimensions with something approaching omniscience, who recognizes in Serge's survival against impossible odds the potential to accomplish what no one else can. Balthazar, the true Balthazar from ancient Zeal, the guru of reason who was thrown into the future by the Ocean Palace catastrophe and spent the remainder of his life creating tools and plans to save the world from threats that had not yet emerged. Before his death in the year 2300, Balthazar completed what he called Project Kid, an elaborate scheme spanning multiple timelines and requiring precise manipulation of events across thousands of years. He arranged for the temporal storm that brought Chronopolis and Dinopolis into conflict. He influenced the creation of fate and ensured the supercomputer would develop specific flaws and blind spots. He manipulated genetics and circumstances to ensure that a young woman named Luca, one of the heroes who defeated Lavos 20 years ago, would create a daughter, or perhaps a clone of herself, who carries particular genetic markers necessary for the plan's success. That child is Kid, the wild and determined young woman who befriended Serge when he first crossed into another world. She is not merely a thief seeking the frozen flame for personal reasons, though she believes that is her motivation. She is a carefully designed tool, a living key created specifically to interact with Serge in ways that will push him along the path Balthazar laid out. Her very existence is part of Project Kid, as is Serge's survival of the Panther attack, as is the dimensional split, as is every major event that has occurred in both Homeworld and Another World for the past 10 years. Balthazar's plan is revealed to Serge in fragments and pieces as he climbs Terra Tower, fighting through the dragon god's defenses and manifestations, pushing toward the summit where answers wait alongside more questions. The the old guru left behind recordings, messages embedded in artifacts and systems scattered throughout El Nido, each revelation timed to occur at exactly the moment when Serge would be ready to hear it. The manipulation is breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Thousands of years of planning and preparation all focused on this single young man from a fishing village who never asked for any of this. The dragon god must be defeated, Balthazar's recordings explain, not because it is evil or because humanity deserves to dominate over alternate evolutionary paths, but because the frozen flame must be taken to a specific location at a specific time. The time devourer exists in the darkness beyond time, unreachable from normal space, but the frozen flame can serve as a beacon, a way to navigate that dimensional void and confront the entity that threatens all of existence. Serge is the only one who can wield the flame for this purpose, the only one whose contact with it as a child created the necessary quantum entanglement or whatever mystical connection allows him to channel its power without being consumed. But even with the frozen flame, even with Serge's unique connection to it, confronting the time devourer would be suicide without one more component: the Chrono Cross itself, an artifact that must be assembled from elements drawn from across both dimensions, gathering the fundamental forces that define reality and binding them together into something that can counteract the time devourer's hunger for oblivion. The cross is not a weapon in the conventional sense, but rather a tuning fork, a way to separate the merged consciousness of Shala and Lavos, to free the princess from the parasite that has been feeding on her despair and using her memories as fuel for its existence. Serge fights his way to Terra Tower's summit, facing challenges that test not just his combat ability, but his understanding of the forces at play, his willingness to continue despite the weight of cosmic responsibility pressing down on shoulders that were never meant to bear such burdens. His companions fight beside him, each of them drawn into this quest through their own paths, but united now in purpose and determination. They have become something more than a random collection of individuals, transformed through shared trials into a genuine team whose trust in each other approaches the absolute. At the top of Terra Tower, they confront the dragon god in its fully realized form, not as 6 separate fragments, but as a unified entity channeling power drawn from the frozen flame itself. The battle is desperate and harrowing, pushing everyone to their absolute limits and beyond. The dragon god wields forces that seem to bend reality itself, attacks that come from multiple angles and moments simultaneously, defenses that regenerate faster than they can be worn down. This is not merely a creature, but rather a living manifestation of an entire alternate timeline's evolutionary path, fighting for validation and survival against a universe that decided its version of Earth should never have existed. But Serge and his companions persevere through skill and desperation, and perhaps some measure of destiny or cosmic intervention. They exploit weaknesses in the dragon god's manifestation, coordinate their attacks with precision earned through countless smaller battles, and ultimately manage to accomplish what seems impossible. The dragon god falls, its form dissipating as the energy holding it together is dispersed. The frozen flame, that fragment of Lavos that has been causing so much conflict and suffering, finally comes into Serge's possession. He holds it in his hands and feels the weight of what comes next, the journey that awaits him beyond the boundaries of normal reality. But first, there are preparations to complete. The Chrono Cross to assemble from elements gathered across dimensions. Kid helps him with this, her knowledge of elements and their properties proving invaluable. Together they combine the fundamental forces, red and blue and green and yellow and black and white. creating a pattern that mirrors the structure of reality itself. The resulting artifact is beautiful and strange, pulsing with potential energy, humming with readiness for the task it was designed to accomplish. It is a tool for healing rather than destruction, for separation rather than fusion, and in that fact lies both its power and its fragility. With the Chrono Cross assembled and the frozen flame secured, with his companions gathered and his purpose finally understood, if not entirely accepted, Serge prepares for the final journey. The way to the darkness beyond time is not through normal space, but rather through layers of dimensional barriers, through places that exist outside conventional geography. Kid stands beside him as the portal opens, that swirling vortex of impossible colors and geometries that leads to places where time itself has no meaning. She tells him that she is coming with him, that whatever awaits beyond cannot be faced alone, and he does not argue. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps companionship matters even in battles against cosmic horrors. Or perhaps Balthazar designed it this way, ensured that Kid would insist on accompanying him because her presence serves some function in the plan's final stages. They step through together, Serge and Kid, crossing from the world they know into the void beyond. The darkness beyond time is not dark in any conventional sense, but neither is it light. It is the absence of qualities, a space where normal descriptors fail because nothing here follows the rules that govern reality. Fragments of destroyed timelines drift past like debris in slow motion, each one a universe that might have been if different choices had been made or different events had unfolded. Serge can see echoes of Zeal here, glimpses of the floating kingdom before its fall, images of the future where Lavos emerged victorious and civilization burned, shadows of timelines where he never existed at, all where his parents never met, where the universe simply followed different paths toward different destinations. And at the center of this dimensional graveyard, vast and terrible and somehow pitiable, waits the Time Devourer. It is enormous, its form combining elements of Lavos's alien biology with shapes that might be Sharla's influence or might be something else entirely. Physical manifestation of concepts like despair and hunger and the desire for everything to simply end. Its eyes, if those can be called eyes, contain intelligence and madness in equal measure. When it notices them, when it recognizes Serge and the frozen flame he carries, the entity speaks in voices that echo across dimensions. The Time Devourer tells them that resistance is futile and also unnecessary. Existence is suffering, consciousness is curse, and the only mercy that can be offered to the infinite multitudes across all timelines is the peace of non-existence. It has been consuming destroyed timelines, growing in power, preparing for the moment when it will finally be strong enough to devour time itself, to eat the concept of causality and progression, and leave behind only the eternal silent void where nothing can suffer because nothing exists to experience pain. It sees this not as evil, but as the ultimate act of compassion, liberation from the cycle of birth and death and struggle that defines all conscious existence. Serge raises the Chrono Cross, feeling its weight in his hands, understanding in this moment what Balthazar intended. This is not a battle to be won through strength or clever tactics. Violence will not solve what ails the Time Devourer because the entity's existence is rooted in trauma and despair rather than malice. The only way to stop it is to heal it, to reach through the layers of Lavos's corruption and reconnect with the person who still exists somewhere within that twisted form. Sharla is still in there, trapped and suffering, her consciousness co-opted by the parasite that merged with her in the moment of its death. The Chrono Cross can separate them, can undo the fusion that should never have occurred, but only if Serge can reach her, can remind her of who she was before the darkness consumed everything. The battle that follows is unlike anything Serge has experienced before. It is fought not just with weapons and magic, but with memory and emotion, with invocations that call upon forces deeper than mere physical power. The Chrono Cross resonates with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself, creating harmonies that counteract the Time Devourer's attempts to unravel existence. Kid fights beside Serge, her determination and spirit providing anchor and support when the cosmic scale of the conflict threatens to overwhelm human comprehension. And slowly, impossibly, they make progress. The Time Devourer's form begins to destabilize, not disintegrating, but rather separating, two distinct consciousnesses pulling apart from their unnatural fusion. Glimpses of Shala emerge, fragments of the kind and gentle princess who once operated the Mammon machine in ancient zeal, while her heart broke for the suffering her mother's ambition caused. She speaks in moments between the Time Devourer's attacks, her voice barely audible but carrying such weight of sorrow and gratitude that it pierces through the chaos of combat. She thanks them, thanks Serge specifically, for coming this far, for refusing to give up despite the impossible nature of the quest. She apologizes for the suffering her existence has caused, for the way Lavos's remnant used her despair as fuel for its hunger. She asks them to finish what they started, to complete the separation even though she does not know what awaits her on the other side. Perhaps oblivion, perhaps something else, but anything is better than continuing to exist as part of the Time Devourer, as unwilling accomplice to the destruction of all timelines and realities. The final moment comes not with grand dramatic flourish, but with something quieter and more profound. Serge raises the Chrono Cross one last time, channeling everything into it. All is hope and determination, and the desperate need for this to end well, for all the suffering to mean something. The artifact blazes with light that is not quite light, with energy that exists beyond conventional physics. And the Time Devourer splits, the fusion undone, Shala and Lavos separated after 20 years of nightmare fusion. Lavos's remnant, that final fragment of the cosmic parasite, dissipates into nothing, its consciousness finally and completely destroyed. Without Shala to anchor it, without her memories and emotions to feed upon, it simply ceases to exist. And Shala herself, freed from the corruption that consumed her, begins to fade as well, not dying exactly, but rather returning to the timeline where she belongs, pulled back into the moment before the Ocean Palace catastrophe by forces that seek to correct the temporal anomalies her presence in the darkness beyond time created. She looks at Serge and Kid one final time before she disappears, and in her eyes is peace and gratitude and something that might be joy. She is going home, back to the kingdom of Zeal, back to the brother she lost and the life that was taken from her. Whether she will remember this encounter, whether she will carry any awareness of what occurred in the darkness beyond time, remains uncertain. But she is free, and that is what matters. That is what all of this was for. Kid watches Shala disappear with an expression Serge cannot quite read. There is relief there and satisfaction, but also something deeper, some personal recognition that suggests connections Serge does not fully understand. Later, when they have returned to El Nido, when the darkness beyond time has released them back into normal reality, Kid will tell him the truth that has been hidden beneath her entire quest. She is not just a thief who happened to befriend him. She is Shala's clone, created by Luca years ago using samples of genetic material that somehow survived across the millennia. raised with purpose and intention to be exactly who she needed to be to help Serge accomplish his role in Balthazar's plan. This revelation should perhaps feel like betrayal, like discovering that everything was manipulation and design rather than genuine friendship. But somehow it does not, or at least not entirely. Kid is real, her emotions and personality genuine regardless of how her existence began. The friendship they developed through their journey together was not scripted or artificial, even if circumstances that brought them together were carefully arranged. Sometimes authenticity can emerge from artifice, and purpose does not negate feeling. She cared about him, cares about him still, and that matters more than genetic origins or temporal manipulation. The return to El Nido is disorienting in ways that go beyond simple transition between dimensions. Something fundamental has changed, not just in Serge, but in the world around him. The dimensional split that separated homeworld and another world is beginning to heal. The two timelines that were artificially separated by his survival 10 years ago, now merging back together into something unified. This is what Balthazar intended all along, Serge realizes. The split was always meant to be temporary, a necessary divergence that created conditions for Project Kid to succeed, but not a permanent division of reality. As the dimensions merge, people from both timelines experience strange moments of doubled memory, recalling events that happened differently or did not happen at all, depending on which version of reality they came from. In some places, the differences are minor, small variations in personal history that amount to little. In others, the changes are profound. People existing in the home world who died in another world, or vice versa. Relationships that formed in one timeline, but never occurred in the other. The process is gradual but inexorable. Reality rewriting itself to accommodate the merger, reconciling contradictions through means that go beyond human understanding. Serge himself feels this merger most acutely of all. He remembers living in home world, remembers growing up in Arni Village with his mother and father, remembers every detail of 17 years of ordinary life. But he also now carries memories of another world, of the 10 years that timeline progressed without him, of his death as a child and the grief that loss caused. He can remember both surviving the Panther attack and dying from it, can hold contradictory truths in his mind simultaneously, without either negating the other. It should drive him mad, this dual existence. But somehow it does not. He is both the boy who lived and the boy who died. And in being both, he becomes something new, something that transcends simple categorization. The physical location of Chronopolis begins to fade as well, not destroyed, but rather returning to the future from which it came. The temporal anomaly that brought it into existence 10,000 years before its creation is being corrected. Causality reasserting itself now that the crisis demanding its presence has been resolved. Fate, that supercomputer consciousness that caused so much conflict and suffering through its attempts to protect humanity from itself, simply ceases to exist as the facility that housed it slips back through time to its proper era. Perhaps there, in the future, things will unfold differently. Perhaps the temporal storm will never occur. Chronopolis will never be thrown into the past. The war with Dinopolis will never happen. Or perhaps history is more stubborn than that, and events will cycle around to produce similar outcomes through different paths. Time is complicated, and cause and effect become tangled when dealing with phenomena that transcend linear progression. Terra Tower sinks back beneath the waves, the dragon god's monument returning to rest alongside the ruins of Dinopolis. The Dragonians are gone, their alternate timeline perhaps restored, or perhaps simply acknowledged as one of infinite possibilities that did not come to fruition in this particular version of reality. The dragon gods themselves, those fragments of the unified entity, disperse into the elements, becoming part of El Nido's ecosystem in ways both mystical and tangible. They are not destroyed but transformed, their consciousness distributed across the islands they once sought to reclaim, finding peace perhaps in becoming part of the natural world rather than its would-be masters. The frozen flame, that fragment of Lavos that caused so much conflict across multiple timelines, loses its extraordinary properties as the last remnants of Lavos's consciousness are destroyed. It becomes merely a crystal, beautiful but inert, containing no more power than any other piece of interesting geology. Serge keeps it for a time, as memento or trophy, or perhaps reminder of everything that occurred, but eventually it simply fades from significance. Without the entity that gave it purpose, it is just an object, and objects have no inherent meaning beyond what conscious beings choose to project onto them. Kid stays in El Nido for a while after everything concludes, unwilling or unable to immediately return to whatever life she left behind when she began her quest for the frozen flame. She and Serge spend time together, not as partners in desperate adventure, but simply as friends, walking beaches and sharing meals and talking about everything that happened and what it might mean. They process their experiences together, helping each other make sense of temporal mechanics and cosmic manipulation, and the strange realization that their entire relationship was designed by someone who died thousands of years ago, but somehow retained enough influence to shape events across millennia. There is a bittersweet quality to these days, a sense of ending and also beginning, of conclusions that open onto uncertain futures. Kid will eventually leave El Nido, will return to the mainland and continue her life's journey in ways Serge cannot predict or control. Whether they will meet again remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. Time has a way of separating people even without dimensional barriers or cosmic conspiracies, and the simple geography of their lives may keep them apart more effectively than any manipulation by temporal mechanics ever could. But they will remember each other, will carry the experiences they shared as permanent parts of their respective identities. And in that remembering, there is connection that transcends physical proximity. Serge himself must decide what to do with the life that has been returned to him, with the reality that has been reshaped around his existence. He could return to fishing, to the simple village life he lived before all of this began, pretending that none of it happened and that he is still just an ordinary young man from Arni. But that feels like betrayal now, like refusing the growth and understanding that came through such terrible cost. He has been across dimensions, has fought cosmic entities in places outside time itself, has been both living and dead, has held reality's fate in his hands and managed not to drop it. That changes a person in ways that cannot be undone or ignored. Perhaps he will travel, will leave El Nido and explore the wider world that he knows exists beyond these islands. Perhaps he will seek out the remnants of knowledge about temporal mechanics and causality, trying to understand more fully the forces that shaped his life. Perhaps he will simply live, making choices day by day and letting the future unfold without trying to control or predict it. All of these possibilities exist simultaneously until he makes decisions that collapse them into single definite paths, and in that potential lies the same freedom that Shala gained through her liberation from the Time Devourer. The freedom to choose, to act, to become something other than what destiny or design intended. The world itself continues turning, seasons progressing and tides flowing, according to patterns that predate human consciousness and will outlast it. El Nido remains beautiful, its islands green and its waters blue, a paradise whose true nature only a handful of people will ever understand. The elements remain in use, those crystalline devices that allow manipulation of natural forces, though most who use them no longer have any conception of where they came from or what they represent. Knowledge fades, as it always does, and what seems momentous and world-shaking in one generation becomes legend in the next and myth in the one after that, until eventually only fragments remain, disconnected from their context and misinterpreted by those who encounter them. But some truths persist despite time's erosive effects on memory and meaning. The truth that individuals matter, that single lives carry weight and significance even against cosmic scales. The truth that friendship and loyalty and simple human connection provide meaning that transcends manipulation or design. The truth that despair and suffering, no matter how deep or prolonged, need not be permanent conditions, that healing is possible even for wounds that seem beyond any hope of mending. The truth that time itself, for all its apparent tyranny and inexorable progression, is not the enemy, but merely the medium through which consciousness experiences existence. Balthazar's plan succeeded, though whether the old guru would recognize the outcome as victory remains uncertain. He set out to prevent the time devourer from destroying all of existence, and in that narrowly defined objective, he accomplished exactly what he intended. But the costs accumulated along the way, the lives disrupted and destroyed, the manipulations and deceptions necessary to push all pieces into proper position. These might have given even that brilliant mind pause if he could have witnessed them. The question of whether ends justify means is one that philosophy has wrestled with since humans first began thinking about ethics, and Chrono Cross provides no definitive answer. It simply shows the consequences, allows observers to make their own judgments about whether the price paid was worth the salvation purchased. Serge stands on the beach at Arni, the same beach where his story began, watching the sun set over waters that have witnessed impossibilities but continue their eternal rhythm regardless. He thinks about Shala, freed from her nightmare prison and returned to whatever fate awaits her in ancient zeal. He thinks about Kid, wherever she has gone, carrying her own burdens and pursuing her own purposes. He thinks about the dragon god and fate and all the entities caught up in conflicts that transcended their understanding. He thinks about his own death and survival, about existing simultaneously as two contradictory truths reconciled into single coherent identity. And he thinks about tomorrow, about the day that will arrive whether he is ready for it or not, about the choices he will make and the path he will walk into an unknown future. The apocalypse has been prevented, not through violence or domination, but through healing and separation, through reaching across dimensional barriers to remind someone of their humanity in the face of cosmic horror. That matters, he decides. Whatever else can be said about everything that occurred, whatever criticism might be leveled at Balthazar's manipulation or fate's control, or the dragon god's revenge, the fact remains that Shala was saved. A person was freed from suffering that should never have been inflicted upon anyone. And if nothing else justified the journey, that would be enough. The story of Chrono Cross is ultimately a story about identity and choice, about how we define ourselves against forces that seek to control or corrupt or consume. It asks whether we are merely products of our circumstances and genetics, or whether something essential exists within consciousness that transcends design and manipulation. It explores the ways trauma can shape entire civilizations across millennia, how suffering in one era creates cycles that perpetuate pain through countless generations until someone finally finds the courage to break the pattern. It demonstrates that healing is possible even for wounds that have festered for centuries, but only if we are willing to confront the sources of that pain, rather than simply fighting its symptoms. The connection to Chrono Trigger, that earlier adventure where heroes from different eras united to prevent Lavos's emergence and save the future from apocalypse, is both intimate and distant. 20 years separate the events of the two stories in linear chronology, but the connections run deeper than simple temporal progression. The heroes of Trigger accomplished their mission, destroyed Lavos, and secured humanity's future, but in doing so, they inadvertently created the conditions for new problems to emerge. Shala's fate, left unresolved in the original story, became the seed from which the Time Devourer grew. The technological advancement that led to Chronopolis's creation only became possible because Lavos was defeated and civilization survived to continue developing. This suggests something profound about the nature of problems and solutions, about how resolving one crisis often creates conditions for different crises to emerge. The heroes of Chrono Trigger were not wrong to fight Lavos. Their victory was not somehow invalidated by the complications that followed, but neither did their triumph create permanent safety or eliminate the need for future heroes to face future threats. History does not end with any single victory, no matter how decisive or world-saving. It continues, unfolding in ways that cannot be entirely predicted or controlled, generating new challenges that require new responses. The characters from Chrono Trigger appear in Cross only as legends and distant memories, people whose deeds shaped history, but who have moved on to their own futures. Luca, the brilliant inventor who helped defeat Lavos, is mentioned as Kid's adoptive mother and creator, but she does not appear directly in the main narrative. Her influence persists through Kid's existence and through the technology she developed, but she herself remains off-screen, living her own life beyond the scope of this particular story. This treatment of previous heroes as legendary but distant figures reinforces the theme that every generation must face its own challenges, that we cannot rely on past heroes to continually save us, but must instead become heroes ourselves when circumstances demand it. The game's structure itself reinforces themes about choice and consequence through mechanics that most players will never fully explore. There are 45 potential party members scattered across the two dimensions, each with their own story and motivations, each representing different aspects of El Nido's culture and history. Some are essential to the main plot, others entirely optional, and the game makes no particular effort to ensure players will encounter everyone or learn everyone's story. This creates a sense of a world that exists beyond the player's direct experience, of lives and narratives unfolding whether or not we choose to engage with them. The recruitment system for party members operates on principles of mutual exclusivity and consequence. Choosing to recruit certain characters prevents recruiting others. Relationships formed in one dimension may be impossible in the alternate reality, and decisions made early in the story can close off options later in ways that are not always immediately obvious. This design philosophy extends the narrative themes about choice and consequence directly into gameplay mechanics, making the player feel the weight of decisions through more than just dialogue and cutscenes. Some of the optional party members carry storylines that rival or exceed the main plot in emotional weight and thematic complexity. Riddell, the general's daughter, can join Serge's party and must confront complicated feelings about her father's actions and the organization he led. Glenn, a knight of the Dragoons who exists in one dimension but died in the other, represents a dark mirror to Serge's own situation of dual existence. Harle, a mysterious jester who serves Lynx for reasons that are not initially clear, eventually reveals connections to the dragon gods and the larger cosmic conflicts that provide context for the entire story. The demi-humans who populate El Nido, those creatures who walk upright and speak with human intelligence despite having non-human forms, represent another layer of the story's exploration of identity and what defines personhood. These beings are neither human nor simple animals, but something in between, granted consciousness and culture through processes connected to fate's terraforming and the element system. They form their own communities, worship their own deities, experience the full range of emotions and aspirations that humans claim as definitively human traits. Their existence challenges comfortable categories about what separates people from animals, what qualifies a being for moral consideration and respect. Some of the game's most poignant moments occur in optional side quests involving these demi-human characters. The story of Mickey, a young girl from a demi-human species called the Fairies, who dreams of becoming a singer despite her people's traditional roles. The tragedy of Radius, a former dragoon who lives in isolation, haunted by the death of his former partner and struggling with guilt that has poisoned decades of his life. The comedy and pathos of Pip, a creature that can evolve into different forms depending on how it is treated, representing the way our choices shape not just ourselves, but those who depend on us. The new Game Plus feature, allowing players to start fresh runs with equipment and knowledge retained from previous playthroughs, creates opportunities to experience the story from different perspectives and with different party compositions. This reinforces the themes about multiple timelines and parallel possibilities by letting players literally explore those alternatives, seeing how events might unfold differently if different choices were made or different people were recruited. Some of the game's endings are only accessible through New Game Plus runs, requiring players to defeat the Time Devourer at unusual points in the story progression, creating scenarios that make no logical sense within the linear narrative, but work perfectly within the thematic framework of exploring branching possibilities. The music throughout Chrono Cross, composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, who also worked on the original Trigger, serves not just as atmospheric accompaniment, but as emotional storytelling in its own right. The main theme, with its blend of traditional instruments and electronic elements, captures the game's fusion of natural beauty and technological strangeness. Each major area has distinctive musical identity, from the tropical rhythms of the El Nido Islands to the ethereal menace of Terra Tower, to the cosmic dissonance of the darkness beyond time. The battle themes build tension and urgency, while the quieter tracks create space for reflection and emotion. Particular musical moments become inseparable from their narrative context. The theme that plays during Kid's first appearance, establishing her as adventurous and slightly dangerous. The haunting melody of the Dead Sea, its minor keys and sparse instrumentation conveying desolation and loss. The triumphant yet melancholic finale, celebrating victory while acknowledging the cost that victory required. The game's soundtrack was ambitious enough to warrant a 3-disc release, containing over 60 tracks that together create an audio landscape as rich and varied as the visual one. The visual design of Chrono Cross represents a significant departure from Trigger's sprite-based aesthetic, utilizing the PlayStation's capabilities to create 3-dimensional environments and character models. While the technology is aged and the graphics appear primitive by modern standards, the art direction remains striking. The color palette emphasizes tropical vibrancy, blues and greens and golds that capture El Nido's paradise aesthetic. while also allowing for darker tones when the story requires them. Character designs range from realistic to fantastical, with particular attention paid to making each party member visually distinctive and memorable despite the large cast. The battle system introduced in Cross, with its stamina-based turn order and emphasis on building element grids through combat, was controversial among players accustomed to Trigger's more straightforward, active time battle system. The complexity of Cross's combat, with its field effects and element levels and combo mechanics, requires more strategic thinking and planning than simply selecting the strongest attacks. This deeper complexity serves the themes about interconnection and consequence, about how actions create conditions that affect future actions, about the importance of understanding systems rather than just reacting to immediate threats. Some players found this complexity rewarding, enjoying the puzzle-like quality of optimizing element grids and coordinating party abilities for maximum effect. Others found it frustrating, preferring simpler systems that did not require extensive planning and experimentation. This division in player response reflects broader tensions in game design about accessibility versus depth, about whether systems should be immediately intuitive or reward careful study and mastery. There is no objective answer to which approach is better, only different philosophies about what makes gameplay engaging and satisfying. The translation and localization of Chrono Cross from its original Japanese presented challenges that affected how Western audiences experienced the story. Certain cultural references and wordplay were difficult to render in English. Some character relationships carried different implications in Japanese that did not fully survive translation, and the philosophical concepts explored in the narrative sometimes used terminology that had no perfect English equivalent. The localization team made choices about how to handle these challenges, prioritizing readability over literal accuracy in some cases, attempting to preserve intended meanings even when exact translations were impossible. Kid's accent in the English version, rendering her dialogue in a sort of Australian-inflected slang, represents one of these localization choices. In Japanese, she speaks in a distinctive dialect that marks her as not native to the El Nido region and gives her dialogue a particular rough energy. The English localization attempted to capture this through vocabulary and grammatical choices that some players found charming and others found distracting. Similar challenges arose with other characters who speak in dialects or registers that signify social position or regional origin, elements that required creative adaptation rather than direct translation. The game's ending remains deliberately ambiguous in ways that frustrated some players while satisfying others. After the Time Devourer is defeated and Shala freed, after the dimensions begin merging and reality reshapes itself around Serge's dual existence, the narrative does not provide clear resolution for every plot thread or definitive answers about what happens next. Kid appears to have forgotten Serge entirely, their shared adventures erased from her memory by the dimensional merger. Serge himself wakes on Opasa Beach as if from a dream, uncertain whether everything that occurred was real or merely elaborate hallucination. This ambiguity serves multiple purposes within the story's thematic framework. It reinforces the idea that some questions have no definitive answers, that reality itself might be more flexible and subjective than we usually assume. It suggests that the journey and the choices made along the way matter more than reaching tidy conclusions. It acknowledges that memory and identity are fragile things, that even our most profound experiences might fade or be recontextualized as time passes and circumstances change. And it leaves space for players to imagine their own conclusions, to decide for themselves what the ending means and what futures await these characters beyond the story's conclusion. The relationship between Serge and Kid, central to the emotional core of the narrative, is never fully resolved or explicitly defined. They are clearly important to each other, their connection forged through shared impossible experiences and mutual trust in the face of cosmic horror. But whether that connection is romantic, platonic, or something that transcends simple categorization remains ambiguous. The game suggests possibilities without insisting on interpretations, allowing players to understand their relationship through whatever lens feels most meaningful or appropriate. This approach to relationships, leaving them somewhat undefined rather than forcing them into conventional structures, reflects broader themes about identity and connection that run throughout the story. People are complex, relationships are complicated, and not everything needs to be labeled or categorized to carry meaning and significance. Serge and Kid matter to each other, helped each other become more than they were individually, and that remains true regardless of what specific terminology we might apply to describe their bond. The fate of the other party members after the story concludes is similarly left to imagination. Some presumably return to their homes and previous lives, carrying memories of their adventure and perhaps changed by it in ways both subtle and profound. Others may continue traveling, seeking new challenges or pursuing personal quests that were interrupted by the crisis with the Time Devourer. The game does not feel obligated to account for everyone or provide closure for every character arc, trusting players to understand that life continues beyond the scope of any single narrative. This restraint in narrative closure stands in contrast to many games that feel compelled to explain everything, to tie off every loose thread and answer every possible question before allowing the story to end. Chrono Cross is comfortable with ambiguity, with leaving certain mysteries unresolved, with acknowledging that some aspects of its world and characters will remain unknown. This approach respects player intelligence and imagination, inviting continued engagement with the story beyond the act of playing through it. The legacy of Chrono Cross in gaming history is complicated and contested. Upon release in the year 2000, it received critical acclaim and commercial success, praised for its ambitious narrative and innovative gameplay, while also drawing criticism for its complexity and departure from Trigger's more accessible approach. Over subsequent years, opinions have remained divided, with some considering it a misunderstood masterpiece and others viewing it as an interesting failure that attempted too much and achieved too little. Part of this division stems from expectations created by Chrono Trigger's legendary status. That earlier game achieved near-perfect synthesis of story, gameplay, and presentation, becoming one of the most beloved role-playing games ever created. Following up such a masterwork would challenge any development team, and the decision to create something drastically different rather than simply recreating Trigger's formula was brave but risky. Some players appreciated the willingness to experiment and innovate. Others wanted more of what they loved about Trigger and felt disappointed by Cross's very different approach. The story's complexity and philosophical density also contributed to mixed reactions. Chrono Cross does not explain everything clearly or present its themes in easily digestible formats. It requires active engagement from players, willingness to piece together information from scattered sources, tolerance for ambiguity and unanswered questions. This makes it rewarding for those who enjoy complex narratives, but potentially frustrating for those who prefer more straightforward storytelling. There is no universal right or wrong answer about which approach is better, only different preferences about what makes stories satisfying and engaging. The game's exploration of free will versus determinism, of whether we control our destinies or merely execute pre-written scripts, gains additional layers when considered in context of its existence as a game. Players make choices about party composition and dialogue options, but these choices occur within parameters established by the developers. Serge's journey is predetermined in the sense that it was written and programmed before any player experienced it. Yet each playthrough is unique based on decisions made within that framework. This tension between authorial control and player agency mirrors the story's own themes about Balthazar's manipulation and Serge's choices, creating fascinating parallels between narrative content and medium. The multiple endings accessible through different playthroughs add layers to this meditation on choice and consequence. Each ending presents a different resolution based on when and how the time devourer is confronted, creating scenarios that range from triumphant to bittersweet to outright tragic. None of these endings is presented as more or less valid than the others. Each represents a possible outcome based on specific circumstances and choices. This reinforces the game's central argument that reality contains multiple potential paths, that different choices lead to different destinations, and that understanding this helps us approach our own lives with appropriate humility about our ability to predict or control outcomes. The relationship between individual agency and systemic forces, another major theme, resonates particularly strongly in the early 21st century context of increasing awareness about how social structures and historical circumstances shape individual opportunities and outcomes. Serge is special, designated as arbiter through circumstances beyond his control, given importance he never sought or desired. But he still must choose how to respond to that imposed significance, must decide whether to accept the role thrust upon him or reject it and face whatever consequences that rejection brings. This captures something essential about the human condition, the way we are all born into circumstances we did not choose, but must still determine how we will respond to the constraints and opportunities those circumstances create. The technological versus natural tension runs throughout El Nido's very existence. These islands are artificial, terraformed through advanced science, yet they have become genuine ecosystems supporting real life. The elements blur lines between technology and magic, between manufactured artifacts and natural phenomena. Fate represents pure technological control taken to its logical extreme, attempting to manage every aspect of existence, while the dragon gods embody natural forces seeking freedom from that control. The resolution does not suggest that either side is entirely right or wrong, but rather that balance must be found between order and chaos, between control and freedom, between the technological and the natural. The demi-humans and their treatment by human society in El Nido raises questions about prejudice and the criteria we use to determine who deserves respect and moral consideration. Some humans in the game treat demi-humans as equals, others as inferior, or even as property. The game does not explicitly moralize but presents these different attitudes and allows players to observe their consequences. Characters who treat demi-humans with respect tend to be portrayed positively. Those who view them as lesser are generally shown as limited or cruel. The message is delivered through demonstration rather than lecture, trusting players to recognize injustice when they see it. The Pore military presence in El Nido, representing an imperial power seeking to expand its control over territories and peoples who never asked for that control, connects to real-world dynamics of colonialism and imperialism. The soldiers are not uniformly evil. Many are simply following orders or believe genuinely that they are bringing civilization and progress to backward regions. But their actions cause real harm regardless of intentions. and the game shows how military occupation disrupts communities and relationships, even when individual soldiers mean no personal malice. This complexity prevents the story from becoming simple propaganda, but still communicates clearly about the costs imposed by imperial ambition. The nature of memory and its relationship to identity threads through the entire narrative. Characters forget or misremember important events. Alternate timelines create contradictory memories that somehow coexist, and the dimensional merger at the story's end raises questions about which memories are real and whether that distinction even matters. Serge's dual existence, his simultaneous identity as both the boy who lived and the boy who died, challenges assumptions about memory as the foundation of continuous personal identity. If we can remember things that never happened to us, if our memories can be completely rewritten, what remains to define who we are? The game suggests that identity might be more fluid and constructed than we usually believe, that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are matter as much as any objective facts about our history. This has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and others, for how we approach questions of change and growth. If identity is not fixed but rather constantly reconstructed through the stories we tell and the memories we choose to emphasize, then transformation becomes possible at any age. Redemption remains achievable regardless of past actions, and the future remains open even when the past seems determinative. Kid's existence as Shala's clone raises ethical questions about genetic engineering, about the morality of creating life for specific purposes, about whether beings designed by others for particular functions can achieve genuine autonomy. She was made rather than born, created by Luca to serve Balthazar's plan, given genes and possibly psychological predispositions that would make her into exactly who she needed to be to help Serge complete his quest. Yet she is undeniably a person, conscious and feeling, capable of making choices that diverge from her designed purpose. The game treats her as fully human despite her artificial origins, suggesting that consciousness and personhood transcend the circumstances of creation. This connects to broader questions about free will and determinism that the story explores from multiple angles. If Kid was designed to help Serge, if Serge was chosen by circumstances he did not control to become the arbiter, if Balthazar arranged everything thousands of years in advance, then in what sense do any of these characters possess meaningful agency? The game's answer seems to be that design and destiny create parameters, but do not eliminate choice. That even when larger forces shape our circumstances, we still determine how we respond to those circumstances. The path may be laid out, but we still must choose to walk it, and in that choice lies genuine freedom. The sacrificial theme established in Chrono Trigger and continued here emphasizes that meaningful change requires cost. Shala sacrificed her peace by operating the Mammon machine, despite knowing it was wrong, trapped by duty and love for her brother into serving her mother's destructive ambitions. Miguel sacrificed his freedom to protect the frozen flame in the Dead Sea, spending a decade in isolation guarding something he knew would eventually be destroyed. Serge sacrifices his normal life, his simple existence as a fisherman's son, accepting the burden of cosmic responsibility because no one else can carry it. These sacrifices are not presented as joyful or desirable, but as necessary, as the price that must be paid when circumstances demand heroism. Yet the game also questions whether sacrifice should be required, whether systems that demand individuals give up everything for collective good are truly just or merely convenient for those in power. Fate demands absolute control, claims its restrictions serve the greater good of protecting humanity from self-destruction. But its version of protection look suspiciously like tyranny, and the game clearly sides against its paternalistic authoritarianism. The dragon gods were imprisoned for thousands of years to power Chronopolis, their freedom sacrificed for humanity's benefit without any consideration for their own desires or rights. This sacrifice is presented as injustice rather than heroic necessity. The distinction seems to be between sacrifices chosen freely and those imposed by others, between costs accepted willingly as part of pursuing meaningful goals, and burdens forced upon people without their consent or understanding. Serge chooses to confront the Time Devourer despite the risks, because he cannot live with himself if he walks away. That is genuine sacrifice. Fate's prisoners, held against their will for purposes they never agreed to serve, are not sacrificing but being sacrificed, and the difference matters morally, even if the practical outcomes might appear similar. The apocalyptic stakes, the threat of all existence being consumed by the Time Devourer, ensure that Serge's choices carry maximum weight and importance. But the game also grounds these cosmic concerns in intimate personal moments, in conversations between friends and quiet scenes of daily life continuing despite the looming catastrophe. This balance between the cosmic and the personal prevents the story from becoming too abstract or disconnected from human experience. We care about saving all of existence because we care about specific people and places that exist within that totality, and the game understands this, never allowing the scope of stakes to overshadow the individual relationships that give those stakes meaning. The ending's ambiguity, particularly regarding Serge and Kid's relationship and whether she remembers their shared adventures, has generated debate and discussion for decades. Some interpret the ending as tragic, suggesting that Kid has forgotten everything and Serge has lost the connection that meant so much to him. Others read it as bittersweet but hopeful, suggesting that even if conscious memory is gone, the experiences shaped who Kid became and will influence her future choices in ways she may not recognize consciously. Still, others argue the ending is deliberately open, refusing easy interpretations in favor of allowing each player to decide what they believe happened. This interpretive flexibility strengthens rather than weakens the narrative by respecting player intelligence and emotional investment. The game trusts that people who have followed this complex story across dozens of hours have developed their own relationships with these characters and their own sense of what would constitute meaningful resolution. Rather than imposing a single definitive interpretation, it provides the framework and allows players to complete the picture based on their own experiences and perspectives. The story of Chrono Cross is ultimately about healing from trauma that spans generations and dimensions, about breaking cycles of violence and retribution that perpetuate suffering long after original causes are forgotten. Sharla's trauma from the Ocean Palace catastrophe created the Time Devourer, which threatened to destroy all existence. The war between Chronopolis and Dinopolis created the conditions for fate's tyranny and the dragon god's imprisonment. Every crisis in the present stems from unresolved pain in the past, and the only way to prevent future catastrophes is to address that pain directly, rather than simply managing its symptoms. This message about breaking cycles and healing trauma resonates beyond the specific fantasy context into broader human experience. We all carry wounds from our past, individually and collectively. Those wounds shape our choices and perspectives in ways we may not fully recognize. Sometimes trauma gets passed down through generations, as children inherit the unresolved pain of their parents and grandparents, creating patterns of dysfunction that persist long after the original sources are gone. Breaking these cycles requires courage to confront pain directly. willingness to feel things that have been suppressed or denied, and commitment to doing better for ourselves and those who will come after us. Serge's journey from simple fisherman's son to savior of existence mirrors the universal experience of discovering that we contain capacities and strengths we never suspected. We all begin life thinking we know who we are and what we are capable of, only to discover through challenges and crises that we can become more than we imagined. This growth is rarely comfortable, often requires us to abandon comfortable assumptions about ourselves and our limitations, but leads to expanded sense of what is possible for us individually and collectively. The parallel worlds and alternate timelines serve as metaphors for the paths not taken in our own lives, the choices we made that foreclosed other options, the alternative versions of ourselves that might have existed if circumstances had been different. We can never know for certain what would have happened if we had made different choices at crucial junctures. We cannot visit alternate timelines where we took different jobs, married different partners, moved to different cities, but we can imagine those alternative paths, wonder about them, and use that wondering to gain perspective on the choices we did make and the lives we currently inhabit. The game's meditation on choice and consequence gains additional weight from the impossibility of fully predicting how our decisions will cascade through time. Serge could not have known that surviving the Panther attack as a child would split the universe into 2 dimensions and eventually require him to save existence itself from consumption by a temporal monster. We similarly cannot know how our choices will ripple forward through time. What consequences will emerge from decisions that seem minor or purely personal in the moment? This uncertainty is not reason for paralysis, but rather invitation to humility, to recognition that we cannot control outcomes and must therefore focus on making choices that align with our values and then accepting whatever consequences emerge. The story refuses simple answers to complex questions, acknowledging that reality is complicated and that different perspectives might all contain valid insights even when they seem contradictory. Fate was tyrannical, but also genuinely trying to protect humanity. The dragon gods sought freedom, but their freedom threatened humans who had nothing to do with their imprisonment. Balthazar manipulated everyone, but did so to prevent apocalypse. Kid was designed as a tool, but became a genuine person. Serge both lived and died. All of these apparent contradictions coexist within the narrative, without being resolved into tidy conclusions, reflecting the complexity of reality itself, where different truths can be simultaneously valid, depending on perspective and context. This comfort with complexity and ambiguity makes Chrono Cross a challenging but ultimately rewarding narrative experience. It demands engagement, rewards attention, invites repeated playthroughs and continued reflection. The story does not provide easy satisfaction or clear closure, but offers instead rich material for interpretation and discussion. Questions without definitive answers, mysteries that remain mysterious. For some, this approach will frustrate, but for others, it represents exactly what sophisticated storytelling should accomplish. Treating audiences as intelligent partners in meaning-making, rather than passive recipients of pre-digested messages. If this journey through dimensions and time resonated with you, if these hours spent exploring parallel worlds and cosmic mysteries brought something meaningful to your evening, consider leaving a like to help others discover these stories. Comments sharing your own experiences with Chrono Cross, your interpretations of its ambiguous ending, or your thoughts about choice and destiny are always welcome. And if you find value in these deep explorations of gaming's rich narratives, the forgotten corners of interactive storytelling that deserve continued attention and discussion, a subscription helps ensure more of these journeys can be shared. But mostly, thank you for traveling with me through El Nido and beyond, through stories of identity and sacrifice, of trauma and healing, of the connections that persist even when memory fades, until our paths cross again in another tale worth telling.